Thanks, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to our Town of Bassendean Council meeting for June. Once again, we're having our meeting online, but we'll be transitioning back to the Council chambers next month. Firstly, nyalak kadij nija buja bal, wajak nunga buja nyalak nini. So it's important for us to acknowledge that the town of Bassendian was founded on the lands of the Wajak Noongar people. They're a very important part of our past and also our present, and I offer our respects as a council and as a community to the Wajak people. Before we go any further, councillors, given that it is an online meeting, we do need to move a motion to suspend a number of the clauses from our meeting procedures local law. So we're requested to move a motion to suspend the operation of clauses 6.8, 6.9, 612 and 617 of the Town of Bassendean Meeting Procedures Local Law 2020 for the duration of this electronic meeting, and that these matters be determined at the discretion of the presiding member. So I'm happy to move that. Is there somebody who's happy to second that motion? Councillor Quinton, thank you. Is there anybody against that? Okay, so that is carried. Thank you, everybody. And just to remind people that tonight's meeting is live streamed and recorded, so members of our community are still able to access council's decisions that affect them, and will be available on our not able to tune into the live recording. And as I said, we'll be transitioning back to the council chambers next month. Initially, potentially just with and then advance of the meeting. So first of all, I just wanted to go through a few announcements for tonight's meeting. So initially, I just wanted to report back on the report or review that we recently endorsed and submitted to WAPC. So WAPC has now considered and accepted the town's report of review of the local planning strategy and the creation of a new scheme. So this is great news, as it's a really important milestone in the creation of a new local planning framework that reflects both our local community's aspirations and the state's planning framework. So this report, as you would remember, contains information on population change and development activity across the district and a recommended course of action going forward, building on the work from Bassendian Our Future. And so the approach that was recommended by the town's planning staff has been accepted, and it's testament to their good work and the ongoing engagement with the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage. So a big thank you to all of the town's staff involved for this work. I also wanted to bring councillors' attention to the fact that there's been an item withdrawn from tonight's agenda, and this is item 1212 relating to the Old Perth Road markets. So given the late nature of this item and feedback received from councillors that there hadn't been adequate time to discuss the options with staff to make an informed decision about the immediate future of the markets, the CEO has withdrawn this report, and it will instead be referred to a councillor workshop for discussion as part of the budget process in early July. Peter, did you wish to make a comment on that before we move on?
Just very briefly, thank you. So just to clarify, the agenda item follows Council's decision from April 2020 to suspend sponsorship grants and events in light of the impact of COVID-19. The agenda item tonight was not intended, was designed to revisit that position, but not intended to bring an end to the market. So I understand there may have been some misinformation or confusion out there. So it definitely wasn't about bringing to an end the markets, but rather to revisit the decision, the position of council. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Peter. And just one final announcement, a very important one. I just wanted to acknowledge that Councillor Quinton celebrated a very special milestone over the weekend. Take the opportunity to wish her a very happy birthday and to thank her for all that she contributes to our community throughout the year. So happy birthday, Councillor Quinton.
Thank you, Renee.
You're very welcome. item 3, attendances, apologies and applications for leave of absence. Given that it's an online meeting, I'm not connected and able to hear. So first of all, do I have Councillor Hamilton?
Yes, present.
And you just said that you're experiencing some freezing at the moment. So please let me know if that continues and I'll make some adjustments where I can. Councillor Gangel?
Oh, only for yourself, Renee.
Thanks. Councillor Gangel?
Yes, here and present. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson?
Good evening, Your Worship. Yes, here and present, and confirm that I've just sent through the email declaring I'm in a secure location for the purposes of the regs.
Fabulous. Thank you. Councillor Quinton, we have seen. Can you hear us, Councillor Quinton?
Yes, thank you. I'm here.
Councillor McWilliam?
Yes, I'm here.
And Councillor Barty?
Present.
Thank you, everyone. We have a couple of applications for leave. So Councillor McWilliam has indicated her intention to be absent at some time from mid-July to mid-August with the dates yet to be defined, but just flagging that with us. She looks they have been finalised. And for myself, the school holidays coming up from July 4th to the July 19th, although I will be here for the workshop in the first week of the school holidays. Is there anybody else who would like to let us know of any intention to take leave? Okay, in that case, I'm happy to move those requests for leave. Is there a seconder?
I'll second.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Is there anyone against? Okay, thank you, everyone. That is carried. Moving on to declarations of interest. Do any councillors? No, okay, in that case, we'll move on to deputations. I've received one from Mr. Don Yates, which I'll read out to you now. It's in relation to item 11, which is the town centre revitalisation. So Mr. Yates has requested that I read this out, and he writes, external consultants. It is suggested that the town, let me start again. Before committing $100,000 for external consultant input into the town centre revitalisation program, it is suggested that the town should undertake the following steps first. Number 1, define what the town centre and zonings are. Number 2, consider the 2007 town centre business development and marketing strategy. It is suggested that responses should be staged and proactive, and Mr. Yates also suggests that the Old Perth Road traders were an issue in 2007 and still today in 2020, and that there should be a town centre marketing association. Thirdly, he asks, what is the status of Ashfield and zonings? So Mr. Yates identifies that Ashfield is another pending activity centre and states that LPS 10 was never amended to include Ashfield Precinct Plan zonings in 2010. He also references the need to plan for the Bradkin site, the adjoining industrial area and the Cyril Jackson campus. And fourthly, Mr. Yates also suggests that there are alternative sources of revenue, considerable cost savings and practical planning initiatives that could be investigated to achieve better outcomes for all. He's also of the opinion that federal and state building stimulus measures boosted by local initiatives should be investigated, and that LPS 10 he believes needs housekeeping and not scrapping for rapid payoffs and community benefits. And that State Planning Policy 3.6, developer contribution for infrastructure, already in LPS 10. He also makes a suggestion for Federal Bridges Renewal Funding Program, and that the town should be aiming for a city status to build on the Your Move campaign. I believe that maybe Mr. Gibson had a couple of responses to Mr. Yates's deputation.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I suppose a lot of that was, an opinion, which is all okay. In terms of the first comment, Local Planning Policy 1 does define a spatial boundary for the purpose of the policy. although contrary to the assertion in the deputation, it's not zoned RAC3. It's actually made up of land zoned both town centre and residential, with densities as low as R10 contained within that policy area. Probably the only other thing I'd add is in terms of the business development and marketing, as identified in the report on the town centre, the actual master plan will be a valuable marketing and promotion tool to enable the town to generate interest from the development sector. So that broadly aligns with the advertising, marketing and promotion comment contained in the deputation.
Thanks, Mr. Gibson. I'm just going to leave my video off for now to hopefully improve the audio. We'll move on to item 6, which is statements by members of the public on agenda items. So we've received a number of statements from Ms. Noni Jacobson. So the first is in relation to item 12.2, which is the long-term cycle network. Ms. Jacobson says that she supports any upgrades and improvement to the cycling network within the town of Bassendean. She comments that streets where the path is adjacent to the road are a hazard for pedestrians, cyclists, people with prams and mobility devices, as they are regularly covered in wheelie bins. She also requests that paths not be located on this alignment in future and that made to avoid removal of existing mature street trees to facilitate the path network's construction. She also comments on item 12.7, which is in relation to rodent control. So she comments that the expense of rodent control with poison baits or traps could be reduced by 1, educating residents to not feed wild birds wheat or other grains, and 2, educating residents to turn any superfluous light at night lighting, as natural predators of rats and mice, such as owls and cats, are both more effective. And finally, in relation to item 12.11, town centre revitalisation, Ms. Jacobson comments that pre-COVID, the community groups using 1 Surrey Street were moved out of the premises pending renovations. The group is now relocated their weekly get-togethers and activity to Bayswater. Therefore, this group no longer visits the Bassendean cafes and has lunch regularly after their craft morning. She's encouraging the town staff to identify a space that could let this talented, creative and sociable group to bring their activity and activation back to the Bassendean town centre. I believe there are some comments from the staff on some of those statements as well.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In terms of the rodent control, the education aspect is covered in the officer report, and in terms of the use of town facilities, our recreation and culture team would be happy to assist looking at options.
Thank you very much. Just to also bring to Council's attention that there were a number of statements received from several community members in relation to the item that's been withdrawn, so 12.12 in relation to the Old Perth Road markets. These comments have been passed on to all councillors for their information prior to the workshop where this will be discussed. Mr Adams, I see I may have cut you off. Did you have a response to provide as well?
Yeah, just on the bike path questions for item 12.2. Yeah, happy to take on board the avoiding the removal of mature trees for the installation of future bike paths, and also to take on board the safety considerations of not putting bikes down adjacent to traffic and trying to keep as much space as possible.
Thanks, Mr Adams. That was it for statements. So we'll move on to questions from members of the public. So there was one question received from Kobe Francis in relation to item 12.3, which is the underground power program for Eden Hill and Bassendean North. So the question was asked why there are only 6 streets in Eden Hill that don't qualify for the underground power. Mr Adams, were you able to respond to that question?
Yes, thanks, Madam Mayor. the project area is driven by Western Power's network. When we look at it as a map, it looks a little bit odd for us, but the reality is that's how their network is run. So in answer to a question, the town has advocated to Western Power to consider additional areas and expand the project area. Western Power have considered our request, but have come back and said, look, it's due to their network area that defines the project boundaries. So there is really, it's not like we can just shift a line on a bit of paper, so that the areas are defined. But you know, the town will be advocating for future undergrounding areas moving forward.
Thank you, and I'd just like to reaffirm that council has adopted a policy which does advocate for the whole of our community to benefit from underground power, and that this project will push the areas of the town that are not included at this point further up the line for inclusion in future projects. So definitely something that is a high priority for the town. Petitions, we don't have any this evening, so we'll move on to item 9, which is the confirmation of minutes. So 9.1a is to receive the minutes of the ordinary council meeting held on the 26th of May. I'm happy to move that motion. Is there a seconder?
I'm happy to second.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Is there anybody against? Okay, so that is carried. And 9.1b, that the minutes of the minutes of May be confirmed as a true record. Again, I'm happy to move that. Is there a seconder?
I'll second that.
Thank you, Councillor McWilliam. Is there anybody against? Okay, that is carried. Thank you, everyone. There's no business deferred from the previous meeting. We'll move on to item 11, which is the external committee reports. So we have an officer recommendation at 11.1 that council notes the attached minutes from the external committee meetings held within the reporting period. Again, I'm happy to move that. Is there a seconder?
I'll second that, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Is there anybody against? Okay, so that is carried. Item 12 are the reports. So 12.1 is for the adoption of reports en bloc. At the moment, these are the reports that I have coming out of en bloc. I have 12.2, 12.4, 12.5, 12.7, 12.8, 12.9, 12.10 and 12.11. Are there any other items councillors would like taken out? Councillor Hamilton?
Can I just get you to run through that list again, because you broke up halfway through for me?
My apologies. I will address my audio in a moment. 12.2, 12.4, 12.5, 12.7, 12.8, 12.9 and 12.11. Councillor Gancher?
Oh, thank you. I'd like to withdraw 12.17. Thank you.
12.17, sure. Councillor Hamilton? Councillor Hamilton? Councillor Hamilton?
Okay, can you hear me, my dear?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I asked for 12.3 to come out.
Oh, 12.3. Okay, the Eden Hill Underground Power Network?
Yep, for one quick question.
Yep, thank you. And Councillor Wilson, did you have a question as well?
No, not anymore. Thank you.
Okay. So in that case, do I have a mover to carry the rest on block?
Yeah, Councillor Wilson, happy to move.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Hamilton, you still have your hand up. Are you happy to second that?
Yeah, I'll second it. I just wanted to double check that 12.10 and 12.11 were out.
Yes, they are. Okay, is there anybody against? Okay, in that case, that is carried. So moving on to item 12.2, this is the Department of Transport long-term cycle network. Mr. Adams, is there anything you would like to speak to on this matter? And then Councillor Ganjo has a question.
Not really, Madam Mayor. I think we covered it all last week in the briefing session, but it is a aspirational document driven by the Department of Transport to try and align the cycling networks across local government. The next stage of the next stage will be to start developing our own cycle plans and projects that that fit into it. So it is it's not a set in concrete document, but it is a aspirational guide that will assist councils to relate with the Department of Transport and achieve some alignment across the network.
Thanks, Mr. Adams. Councillor Hamilton.
Sorry about that. I've just put up the alternative that I circulated earlier today, which is only a minor addition dot point.
No.
I can't see it. I can't see it in the chat. Where have you put it up, please?
I have a question before we go to any motion. Can I ask my question?
Yes, Councillor Ganjo.
Thank you. My question is, I'm just looking on page 12. It's actually got a recommendation there for council, which I actually think spells it out quite nicely, that council endorse the aspirational long-term cycle network developed in collaboration between town officers and the Department of Transport. Endorsement does not commit council nor the state government agencies to deliver all or any part of the program within a particular timeframe, nor does endorsement commitment any parties to funding any specific route within the plan. Council endorsement confirms support for local and state government agencies to work together in endeavouring aspirational LTCN over the longer term. I'm just wondering why that recommendation wasn't actually used as the officer recommendation.
Mr. Adams, are you able to respond to that question?
Look, we could have used that as the officer recommendation. I suppose it goes into the detail of the report. We I suppose, tried to keep the officer recommendation quite high level. Yes, there's no reason why that can't be used.
The only reason I ask
is chooses to.
Yeah, the only reason I ask, it actually just states there that it doesn't actually bind council in any way, whereas there's no mention of that in the officer recommendation. So if you look at the recommendation that's been suggested to council and the officer recommendation, if you read the officer recommendation, it looks like it binds council, whereas that alternative on page 12 doesn't. It actually stipulates that council isn't bound in any way to providing funding or any part of the plan going forward.
Yeah, that's correct, Councillor. Yep.
Councillor Ganjo, if you're planning to propose an alternative wording, would you mind typing it into the chat so that everybody has a clear record of what it is?
The only problem is, Your Worship, it will take me quite some time to type it into the chat, so you're going to have to bear with me while I type away.
Okay, no problems. Councillor Hamilton, while that is being typed, you have your hand raised?
Yes, Councillor McWilliams said she couldn't see the slight amendment that I had put into chat, and I just wanted to confirm whether councillors can actually see that now.
I'm not able to see it.
No, I'm not able to see it either, Councillor Hamilton.
Hey.
While the typing's happening, would I also be able to ask a question, please?
You may.
Thank you, Worship. And I apologise, I'm an Apple Mac user, and the Apple version of the Teams program doesn't have a provision for me to put up my hand, so this is the only way that I've got to indicate my desire to speak. So the question goes to engineering guidelines or standards around road works for cycle infrastructure. So referring back specifically to the Broadway project, where we had the 2 painted cycle lines put on the road, and the consequence of that being that there wasn't enough room then to be able to do medium strip tree planting. I'm just wondering if you're aware if the state government is doing any sort of design work or engineering standards work around what cycle infrastructure should look like going forward as a part of this process.
Yes, Councillor. Through the chair, the Department of Transport, Main Roads and Local Government are reviewing their cycling standards. They're reviewing 2 standards, the Local Area Traffic Management Standard and the cycling standard as well, because they both closely interrelate. They've been under review for almost it's been over a year and a half, and it's out for final comment at the moment. And it is to try and address, it's trying to address these types of issues and to provide some standards for the industry moving forward. There is always that clash of, of what occurred down Shackleton Street where medians were put in, and that limited the availability for cyclists to, not just cycle lanes, but even just cyclists to ride down the street. And these things are problematic. So there's 2 standards at the moment that are coming to a close to try and improve the standard across the sector for all the agencies, Department of Transport, Main Roads and local governments as well.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Councillor Hamilton?
Through the chair, this is another question for Mr. Adams. I note on page 9, I had some concerns in the agenda because the second dot point basically said, it's in red, it indicated that routes can only be excluded when there are engineering or land tenure issues. So clearly that prompted me to put in my second dot point in my suggested amendment. I just need to ensure that we have flexibility going into the future, and that's why I've put that in. I'll also refer back to Broadway because there was an email that I sent to you and the CEO some months ago in respect to the scope of works that are provided by the state government entities in respect to doing projects. What is the quality control to actually ascertain that the works have been done to the scope that is originally provided to council when they approve these things? And you'll know where I'm coming from because in my mind, the scope of works were not completed 100% as per what we approved.
Thanks, Councillor. There is quality control in place, and I'm not sure. I thought I did answer that question, and I think you're referring to the green bike lanes for Broadway. Without going into the detail, which I suppose I already am, so I apologise. But the green bike lanes, the green painted parts of the bike lanes were in an earlier version that was presented to council. A later version of the final design, it was altered due to Main Roads deciding that the green bike lanes didn't fit their remit for having, or the numbers of cyclists, pedestrians and vehicles did not meet the remit for having green cycle lanes. That did not come back to council as I reviewed the answer from the response from Main Roads and decided it was quite a minor change. And that it was a minor technical change and didn't really have a significant impact upon the desired outcome of the infrastructure that was being put in place. So I do believe there is quality control that's in place.
Thanks, Mr. Adams. Councillor Hamilton, you still have your hand raised. Did you have a further question?
No, sorry.
Okay. So hopefully councillors can see in the chat the proposal. So we've got the officer recommendation, and then we've got a proposed amendment from Councillor Hamilton, which adds point 2, and we also have an alternative from Councillor Gangel, which is essentially what is written on page 12 of the agenda. So we have 3 options before us, so I need somebody to move one of those motions.
Your Worship, I'm happy to move my motion. I've just typed it in there. I've taken out some of the wording about officers and department staff working on the plan at the beginning part.
Okay, fabulous. Would you mind reading out your motion, please, Councillor Gangel?
Yep, no problem.
Sorry, just Councillor Wilson here on a point of order.
Yes, Councillor Wilson.
I'm not sure if Councillor Hamilton's microphone is working or not, but I noted that Councillor Hamilton did put up her alternative amendment first and was just checking to see if she should be given the opportunity to move that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, fair enough.
I will ask a question because I think both are aiming for the same outcome to give us flexibility, but I will ask a question. Going back to the original officer's recommendation, it included Lord Street between Walter Road East and Guildford Road to be included as a secondary route. If I'm correct, that is not currently in what is being proposed. Would I be correct in that assumption?
Yes, that's correct, because based upon some of the questions that were asked at last week's briefing session, that was myself who identified that there was some misalignment between some of our own planning aspirations and what was reflected in the long-term cycle network that had been presented to us. So in response to that, the agenda now reflects in the officer recommendation an additional point that says subject to Lord Street between Walter Road East and Guildford Road to be included as a secondary route and reassigning 7th Avenue as a local route. So I'm not sure whether either Councillor Hamilton or Councillor Gangel with their amended motions would wish to include that.
Okay, well, I actually do have that included in my amendment as point 1, so it's the same as the officer's recommendation. And the only additional point I've put in is point 2, Town of Bassendean can modify, remove or add to endorsed LTCN routes as part of future bike plan reviews. I do take on board that there's very little difference in the outcome between my amendment.
Councillor Hamilton, are you planning on moving your motion or are you letting Councillor Gangel move his motion?
I will move it. I'll move it. Thank you.
Your motion?
Yeah, seconded, Councillor Wilson.
Okay. Is there anybody against?
Yes, Your Worship.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Gangel. Councillor Hamilton, would you like to speak to your motion?
No, I'll waive my right. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson?
Thank you, Worship. Yeah, I'll exercise my seconding rights. I think it's fair to say that Councillor Hamilton's motion is substantially similar to Councillor Gaingel's, but for the fact that it specifies the Lord Street between Walter Road East and Guildford Road to be included as a secondary route, and reassigning 7th Ave as a local route, which I think is probably specific feedback that I would be happy to endorse to send back to the state government so that they have early opportunity to amend their plans in relation to those two variations. And otherwise, I'm happy to second the motion.
Thanks, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Gangel?
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, very quickly, mine isn't against Councillor Hamilton's motion per se. It's just that I think the recommendation on page 12 that actually states that neither the town nor the state government is bound by this proposal, I think is very good wording to actually put in the recommendation, because obviously at any point in time there can be changes and will be changes made along the way. So I think I just noted that on page 12 that I thought that wording was quite smart just to put in there, with funding and also with the outcomes, that neither party are actually bound by it, and that it's simply an aspirational document that will work together to achieve outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Gangel. Are there any other speakers for the motion? Against the motion? I'll just speak quickly. I think both of these motions, the one that we're currently discussing and the one proposed by Councillor Gangel, reflect the intention of council. I do prefer the wording of Councillor Gangel's, but the inclusion of the Lord Street component, I think, is important feedback to give to the state government. So in the absence of that being included in Councillor Gangel's, my preference would be to support Councillor Hamilton's motion. I'll just give Councillor Hamilton the opportunity to speak to her motion to close if she so wishes.
No, I'm fine, thank you. I'll leave that to the vote.
All right, so we have Councillor Hamilton and Wilson for the motion. Councillor Gangel against the motion. Councillor Quinton, are you for or against?
For the motion.
Councillor Barty?
For the motion.
Councillor McWilliam?
For the motion.
And I will be for the motion, so that is carried. Thank you, everybody. Moving on to 12.3, this is the proposed Eden Hill Power Pilot Project. Councillor Hamilton, you had a question on this item for the staff?
Yes, I'm just finding my document. I had some questions about the addition of the third dot point in the officer's recommendation, which was not in the briefing document last week. So this is waiving 250,000 in respect to our time. Sorry, that's the wrong wording. Can I just ask, roughly how much does that work out to per household? Has anyone actually got that figure, that 250,000? And I know it's over 3 years, and I know it doesn't start till 2021, 22.
Phil, you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry. I think there's about 1,000 households, so that would be $250.
Thanks for that. Kath, is that your only question?
Yeah, look, the only point that I'd make with this is that it seems that the price, the subsidy price being offered through this program is already incredibly economical. So I'm trying to actually ascertain how we justify removing those administrative costs when the next time we do power through the undergrounding of power through the standard program. I believe the costs, if the staff would tell me, I believe the costs through the standard program at the moment are an average of $7,000 to $8,000 per household. Is that right?
That's my understanding. Is that correct, Mr. Adams?
Yep, that's the latest prices that I have. I think some of them are a bit north of that, around 10, but yep, it's around there.
So, Councillor Hamilton, we have the officer recommendation. If you're not supportive of point 3, then you're very welcome to vote against it and debate it at that stage. Are there any other questions before we move a motion? No? Okay. Well, is there somebody who would like to move the officer recommendation or an alternative?
Yeah, Councillor Wilson here. I'd like to move the officer recommendation, please. Thank
you, Councillor Wilson. I'm happy to second that. Is there anybody against the motion? Okay, that is carried. Thank you, everybody. Moving on to 12.4, it's the draft local planning policy design review panel for final adoption. Councillor Gangel, is that a question?
Yes, Your Worship.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Look, just want to give a shout out to our neighbours in Bayswater who are in their council chambers tonight and welcoming back the members of their community into their council chambers. And with, in reference to the city of Bayswater, the city of Bayswater currently have slashed their fee. I think we've got it proposed here for $2,500 or $3,000. I was speaking to the City of Bayswater today, a councillor, and they've advised me that they're now charging $1,000 for the fee. So would we be looking to do like for like or continue with the $3,000? Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Gangel. My understanding from the advice received from our office previously is that at this point in time, we're not actually determining what fees we would be charging. That would be part of our budgeting process. We're just adopting the policy. Is that correct, Mr. Gibson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yes, that is correct. If Council adopts this policy, then the next checkpoint will be in July as part of the budget process, where Council will be able to set out the fees and charges.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Gangel?
Thank you, Your Worship. I did think, I'm just trying to look at the report now. I thought I saw somewhere in the report that we're looking to put this through tonight if we passed it. Oh, so on page 20, it says currently charged $2,500. I thought it said somewhere that the town was looking to actually implement in our budget if we passed it tonight. The town will be proposing a fee of $3,000 in the 2021 budget, which would cover the fee required to be paid for the City of Bayswater and partial cost recovery and expenses incurred by the town. So we're not actually passing that tonight. I just want to confirm that.
No, that's correct. Mr. Gibson?
That's correct. If Council resolves to adopt this policy tonight, it is certainly open to Council in a month's time to adopt the fee of $3,000, $2,500, $1,000 or no fee, but that's a decision for next month.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Okay, are there any further questions?
Yep, Councillor Wilson here with a question.
Yes, Councillor Wilson.
Just in relation to the reduction in the fee from the City of Bayswater, do we know at this stage if this is a temporary COVID-19 relief measure or a long-term change in the fee structure for the City of Bayswater?
Mr. Gibson, would you have that information at hand, or is that something we can seek from the City of Bayswater between now and when we make our budget decisions?
Through Madam Mayor, yes, we're unaware of their fee structures, but we can certainly do some research over the next few weeks to work out their intended approach.
Yeah, just to clarify, so yes, I was told that it was at the moment part of a COVID-19 approach, but they're looking at potentially keeping it to try and encourage development and investment into the city.
Okay, great. Thanks for that information, and hopefully the staff will be able to clarify for us when we're making our own budgetary decisions. Yes, Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. Just a supplemental follow-up question to that then. Could we also please seek clarification whether it would be the City of Bayswater's intent to treat us in the same way as they're treating their ratepayers, that is to give us the discount also, or whether they would intend to pass on the full fees to us as a neighbouring council?
I'm sure the staff can seek that information. Yep, thank you, Mr. Gibson.
Through
Sorry.
Madam Mayor, yes, we'll certainly ask that.
Okay, if there's no further questions, do we have a mover for the officer recommendation?
I'm happy to move that, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor McWilliam. And a seconder?
I'll second.
Councillor Hamilton. Is there anybody against the motion? Okay, so that is carried. Moving on then to 12.5, this is the revocation of Council Policy 1.17, which is Development Bonds Policy, compliance with conditions of planning consent. Firstly, are there questions? Okay, in that case, is there a mover for the officer recommendation? Councillor. I've got everyone's screens flashing. Can someone turn their camera on and let me know who's moving the motion, please?
I'll move the motion, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. I'm happy to second that motion. Is there anybody against? Okay, in that case, it is carried. 12.7 now, this is the review of the instrument of appointment and delegation for the Bassendean Local Emergency Management Committee. Any questions firstly? Okay, do we have a mover for the officer recommendation? Councillor Barty.
I'm happy to move the motion, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Is there a seconder?
Yes, I'll second that. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor McWilliam. Is there anybody against? Okay, so that is carried. Sorry, would you mind turning your microphone off, Councillor McWilliam? Item 12.8, this is the draft local planning policy number 13 relating to tree retention and provision, up for final adoption. Councillor Gangel, you have a question?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a quick one. Just in relation to, it just says the financial considerations. So it says the cost of publishing a notice in a newspaper circulating in the district can be met through council's approved operational budget. But that's the only thing that says that we need to give consideration to. I'm just wondering if we're lodging notes on people's titles, is there a fee for the town that would be required to be paid for us to lodge notes on titles?
Thanks, Councillor Gangel. Mr. Gibson?
Through you, Madam Mayor, there would be a cost. It would be a cost borne by the developer or landowner, as the case may be, and they would bear that cost as a means of satisfying a condition of development approval. So the only cost implication for council as part of adopting this policy is, in fact, the publication in the local newspaper.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, then do I have a mover for the officer recommendation or an alternative?
Councillor Wilson, I'm happy to move the officer recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Is there a seconder? Okay, I'm happy to second that.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Is there anybody against the motion?
Yes, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Gangel. Councillor Wilson, would you like to speak to your motion?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just briefly, there's been a lot of discussion about this policy over previous briefing sessions and workshops. I'm very comfortable that what this policy does is preserve space for trees rather than to preserve individual trees. I think it is very important, given the effects of climate change and urban infill, that we preserve as best we can space for trees. I think this policy provides a good balance between giving landowners and developers the opportunity to make the best and highest use of their land, and also to preserve the amenity of our community. The feedback that I get most often from people in our community when they're talking to me about what they love most about our town is the trees, the country town feel to it. And as a councillor, I'm keen to preserve that and ensure that we are making provision for space for trees in future developments and urban infill that happen. And to that end, I support the officer recommendation in the draft policy.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. I will speak briefly to the motion as well. Firstly, though, I'd like to just thank our staff, particularly Donna Shaw, for their excellent work on this policy and for taking the time to work through all of the details with councillors in the time since this was last brought to council. It is a topic that is close to many of our hearts, and there has been a desire to do what we can to preserve tree canopy without detrimentally impacting the development potential in our town. Our community has consistently identified that having a green leafy suburb is a very high priority, and this has once again been reinforced recently through the Bessendium Our Future consultation and also the Catalyse survey. And the enormous value that our community places on trees is evident every time that there is an issue that relates to trees in our community. When we have a look at our current strategic community plan, it identifies several objectives around displaying leadership in environmental sustainability and protecting our biodiversity, and all of these are supported by this policy. We also have a draft new strategic community plan that Council has already endorsed for feedback, and this identifies the creation of a more green and shaded town as a specific objective, with a strategy being the protection of existing trees. So this policy assists in achieving this objective, albeit with the current limitations of the Planning and Development Act of 2005 that we have to work within. I am aware that there have been some misinterpretations in the community about this policy. It does not propose a tree levy or caveats on, or the introduction of caveats on people's properties. This policy is not about punishing people or limiting development, but instead it's about incentivising the retention of trees, encouraging people to recognise the value of mature trees on their property, and to facilitate more creative planning and designs in order to retain as many trees as possible for the benefit of our community. For me personally, I am much more interested in outcomes that will benefit our community as a whole in the long term, rather than what might be simpler for a developer in the short term. And this policy is a step in the right direction to delivering this. As a council, we have invested significantly in increasing tree canopy on our public land through our own tree planting program, with 1,000 trees going into the ground this winter. But we know that the majority of tree canopy loss is still on private property, and we need to find ways of limiting this loss if we're to achieve our town's vision of a green, shady, biodiverse community. So undoubtedly, there's more that needs to be done if we're to avoid having suburbs that are devoid of trees in backyards, but this requires stronger controls at the state level. However, until such a time as these changes are made, this policy that we're considering tonight significantly strengthens the town's ability to require the provision of trees and to encourage the retention of existing trees. So I do want to see the state government step up and the definition of development change to include the clearing of trees. And this is something that we can more strongly advocate for with the support and backing of our community, as this motion supports. I think leaders need to hear our voices just as strongly as they currently hear the voices of the development industry if there's to be the necessary changes around tree retention legislation to deliver the outcomes that are in the long-term interests of our community. So I encourage councillors to also support this motion. Thank you. Councillor Gange, your opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, my opposition is I'm philosophically opposed to putting notes or caveats. I mean, you call it a caveat. A note is still a warning that is issued on a title that is brought to attention of a potential purchaser. So regardless of what it's for, whether it be for tree purposes, or whether it be for floodplain areas. A classic example was a few years back where a resident in the town wanted to do an extension to her house, but she would have been, in her view, she came to council, unfairly impinged upon by having to put a caveat on her property, or a warning on, or a note on her property that this was in a particular area where all her other neighbours around her did not have the same on their properties. So I am philosophically opposed to putting notes or caveats or anything of the like on people's properties that potentially highlights a warning or an issue with the property itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Gangel. Mr Gibson, can I just ask you to clarify for councillors and any community members who are interested in this topic? Councillor Gangel has referred to caveats. You've previously clarified that caveats are not being applied to people's properties. Would you mind elaborating so everybody is clear about what is being considered?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. That's correct. There's nothing in the policy that mentions a caveat. A caveat is a proprietary encumbrance that limits a property owner's ability to transact on a property. What we're talking about in the draft policy is simply a notification on title, which is purely information. It in of itself isn't an encumbrance, or it is not a requirement. The requirement exists by virtue, or will exist by virtue of the development approval. The notification is just simply information to a prospective purchaser to ensure that if they buy a property, they are appropriately informed of matters that will affect them.
Thank you, Mr Gibson. Councillor Gandry, you had your hand up. Did you have a question? Councillor Gandry?
Oh, sorry. There we go. Sorry, Your Worship. Just with the note, Mr Gibson. So a note is obviously alerting a potential buyer to limitations on the block. In this case, in relation to the tree aspect. So therefore, they will be informed of what is and isn't possible to do within their garden, because my understanding reading the policy is you'd have to seek approval before altering what's currently there on the block.
Thanks, Councillor Gangel.
That's correct, but I would stress the point that the notification is not bringing about the obligation. The obligation will exist irrespective. If council adopted the policy without a requirement to put a notification on the title, they could. It just means that a prospective purchaser could potentially purchase a dwelling with an associated tree and tree preservation area, tree growth zone, but be unaware of their obligation to maintain it. And they could then thereafter remove it, thinking they're doing nothing wrong. In fact, they've actually committed a breach and would be opening themselves up to prosecution. To ensure people aren't caught unaware in that sort of scenario, we're recommending notifications be put on the title.
Thanks, Mr Gibson. So we were in the middle of debate. Councillor Wilson and myself had spoken for the motion. Councillor Gangel has spoken against. Are there any other councillors who would like to speak for the motion? Against the motion? Councillor Wilson, would you like your right of reply?
Yeah, thank you, Worship. Just briefly, look, I'd like to start by acknowledging Councillor Gangel's strong and consistent representation for the rights of property owners in our community. I understand his desire to do so, and I think it's well placed. What I would say, though, in respect to this particular policy, as outlined by Mr Gibson, this provides a protection to future owners of the property so that they are fully aware that development concessions were provided to the previous owner on condition that they provide space for trees. So I see it as a protection measure for future owners, and for that reason think that it is desirable to put a note on the title to provide that protection. Otherwise, I support the motion and encourage others to do the same.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. So Councillor Wilson and myself are for the motion. Councillor Gangel is against. Councillor Hamilton?
For the motion. Thank you.
For the motion. Councillor Quinton?
For the motion.
Councillor McWilliam?
For the motion.
And Councillor Barty?
For the motion.
Thank you, everyone. That is carried. Moving on to item 12.9, which is rodent control. Firstly, are there any questions for our staff? Sorry, Councillor McWilliam?
Yes, just in terms of the recommendation, just referring to page 41, when we're at the top of the page, it has a section on community education, and it finishes up with this information is available on the town's website to assist residents in managing their properties to control rodents. Once again, not everybody is able to actually see the website, not being online, etc. So I just wonder whether we could also add that maybe a note that notes that the town will provide community education for the control of rodent populations in several media, or words to that effect. I can type that up if you like.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Is there any response that the staff would like to give to that request?
Through you, Madam Mayor, typically if a landowner isn't able to access information online, they can always call our environmental health officers to discuss directly or come to the front counter, and on request we can provide hard copy information if that's required. But I'm not sure a council resolution on that is particularly required.
Thanks, Mr Gibson. Councillor Hamilton, you also have a question?
Yes, just bringing councillors' attention to the alternative they've put up in chat, which does have a dot .4, which I added about education for Councillor William if she wants to read that. I do have a question though before I move that. My recollection is that the expenditure that we budget allocate at the moment for the rat baits is, I think it was 2,500 up to 3,000. Is that correct?
Through Madam Mayor, yes, that's correct.
So I didn't get a response to the alternative that I provided earlier today, but clearly, you know, there are various methodologies out there, and I do know, Mr Gibson, that last week in the briefings you provided some different ideas about the methodology, but the rodent problem, as far as I can tell, is divided into two categories. There is the category where we supply to householders rat baits on request, but there's also a program that we do in our drains and what have you close to the river to control rats in reserves. Is that correct?
Through Madam Mayor, broadly that's correct. We have Council Policy 5.7, which deals with our community and how involved we are or are not in providing them rat baits. Separate from that, we have our suite of land assets and building assets which are subject to their own rodent control regime.
Okay, so the alternative that I've put up where I suggest that we spend up to a maximum of $2,000 to trial a non-toxic methodology in those locations which are town controlled and owned. Do you see a problem with that if we do a trial for 12 months to ascertain if you know, these alternative non-toxic methods are appropriate for use in other areas?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's open to council to request a trial. However, such a trial hasn't actually been properly scoped, nor have we sought quotes from the town's pest control contractor. Therefore, it's going to be difficult to gauge the likely efficacy of a trial, particularly given that vermin tend to move around, and a localised trial might be of negligible value. And I suppose in any event, it's not clear from the amendment what would be measured as part of that trial. So if council was of the mind to pursue a trial, it would probably need quite a bit more work from staff to scope it as to how far $2,000 would go, because as based on the prices contained in the report, particularly on page 40, to engage our contractor to do additional duties, including providing monitoring, servicing, baiting of traps, and thereafter disposing of any carcasses. That is going to be something that we need to scope out with the contractor, and $2,000 may not provide an effective trial.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, you may.
Okay. I do note that we have an endeavour to actually provide environmental sustainability, and over the years, council has repeatedly bought rat baits without questioning them. What I'm asking for is a small trial of a product that doesn't need to be replaced. It only needs to be reset every 6 months or so. So, and I also note that you're correct, the individual unit price presented last week, that is correct, but I also went onto the website and had another look where there are bulk prices for 5 and 10 units. So, again, I'm not entirely sure if we're using baits in certain localities on a regular basis. I'm not entirely sure of how difficult that is if you've got something that's set and forget for 6 months.
Councillor Hamilton, given your interest in this and the concerns that staff have identified around the kind of trial that you're proposing at this point, maybe you would like to consider adding an additional point to the officer recommendation where the staff could scope out what the trial would involve, and then with that information at hand, council could then make a decision around the whether we wanted to conduct the trial at that stage.
I note that Mr. Gibson has his hand back up before I actually respond to that. Yes, no? Nope, hand's gone back down.
No, it hasn't, Councillor Hamilton. Mr. Gibson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In terms of the comment about it can be left for 6 months, that's not actually the case. It would need to be checked probably daily to make sure the carcasses are effectively removed, and also to check that there are no injured animals stuck in the trap. So it's not a case of just leaving it there for 6 months. It needs to be actively monitored. And that's the reason I made the comment about the $2,000 not going particularly far, as we'd have to obviously get a quote from the pest control contractor as to what a daily inspection regime would cost the town.
Thanks, Mr. Gibson. We'll give Councillor Wilson the opportunity to ask a question. I know you've got a further question in a moment, Councillor Hamilton.
Thank you. So something's just occurred to me whilst listening to Councillor Hamilton's contribution and Mr. Gibson's answer there. If the town were to offer ratepayers the choice between the racumen baits, which I understand have been selected because they reduce secondary poisoning risk to native animals, if some community members preferred instead to have a non-chemical based rat catching setup, would it be possible for the town to offer a choice between baits and mechanical traps?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it'd certainly be open to council to do that, but there would be some significant financial implications of such an approach. Obviously, the Rack-Yamen is the most cost-effective measure, but if the town was to offer and provide free of cost non-chemical solutions, as identified on page 40 of the agenda, there would be a significant financial implication for council.
Just a follow-up question to that. I'm not familiar with the way the automatic traps operate. Are they single use or are they reusable?
Through you, Madam Mayor, they're reusable. They have a piston that once enacted by the rodent or any other animal for that matter, the piston fires, and that is the method. But there still needs to be regular inspections to make sure there's no dead animals trapped in the actual in the device, and probably more importantly that there are no injured animals trapped in the device.
Thank you. So just one final follow-up question. So if council were to set a cap on the budget for automatic traps and it was offered to the community subject to availability, would that alleviate any concerns about the potential cost impact of such a proposal?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that would alleviate the financial implications by capping the commitment from council. It doesn't actually resolve the OHS and personal health and safety issues because a piston fires, and that is the method for effectively killing the rodent. There is a potential danger to the user, and whether it's appropriate for the town to be providing those, and whether the town would have any liability for providing those to the community if something was to happen to a community member. So there would potentially be an OH&S risk the town would have to accept.
And small hands going into such a device being pistoned might pose a hazard to children potentially.
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, that's correct.
Councillor Wilson, you may already be aware of this, but just wanted to bring your attention to the fact when you were exploring the potential for community members to be offered either the Rack-Yamen or the trap, that the current officer recommendation is for council to no longer be providing rat eradication methods for our community. So it would be a completely different proposal from what is currently before us. Councillor McWilliam and then Councillor Hamilton.
Yes, I'm just, I think I've been misreading this whole piston thing. I didn't think that they were being hit on the head or you know, receiving a blunt force. I thought it was actually the gas shot that they were receiving and they would just drop out of the thing dead pretty much immediately. Is that different to what you're talking about, Mr. Gibson?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, the gas actually fires the piston, but it's the piston that effectively kills the animal.
Yeah, so the reverse of what I was thinking it was. Okay, thank you.
And Councillor Hamilton, your question.
If you'll note that I followed the officer's line of thinking in restricting my alternative to simply works that are involved with town assets and town staff rather than the public, if only because I wanted to actually see a trial happen first to ascertain how advantageous this might or might not be in the public realm. So I did take the officer's thoughts on board in respect to that.
Councillor Hamilton, do you have a question or are you debating your motion?
No, I'm not debating. I'm actually tired of debating.
Okay. So we have an officer recommendation and we have an alternative motion from Councillor Hamilton. Would somebody like to move one of those motions or something else? Councillor Barty? You're on mute, Councillor Barty.
Gosh, apologies. I'm happy to move the officer recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Is there a seconder for the officer recommendation?
Yeah, seconded, Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Is there anybody against the motion?
I'm against the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Hamilton. Councillor Barty, would you wish to speak to the motion?
Sure. Just briefly, by no longer providing rat traps to the community, we're providing a budget saving, and it was identified in the officer's recommendation that alternate methods of rat traps would present a safety risk to the community and an occupational health and safety concern, which I don't think has been satisfied or overcome in the debate this evening.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Councillor Wilson, did you wish to speak to the motion?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, just briefly to say, whilst I continue to have concerns about secondary poisoning that might occur throughout our town from the chemical use of rodent control, I still have concerns about the risk to health and safety around the use of a piston by uncontrolled or unlicensed operators, and for that reason, out of an abundance of caution, I support the officer recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Hamilton?
Yes, I had supported a trial of an alternative, a non-toxic alternative. There is nothing to stop the public from going and buying rat baits from hardware stores, so secondary poisoning will continue. We are a council that adjoin the river, so rat infestations are a problem within the town. There's no use pretending that not giving out baits will stop the problem. It won't. I think it is incumbent upon us to look at alternatives. We are a council that promote ourselves as being environmentally sensitive. We certainly go along the path of steam weeding as opposed to chemical weeding. I do not support the giving out of baits to the public, and I was looking for an alternative, a middle road, if you like. I did not particularly want to put something out into the public realm without having a trial first, and that was why I took the officer's comments on board and restricted my motion to basically things that happen in the town controlled areas. I do know that in New Zealand that this product has been used extensively throughout all their natural areas, because rats are a problem for bird life, and it has been proven to be an incredibly advantageous product that can kill up to 20 or 30 rats before it has to be reset. The openings and the way it is actually designed is designed not to create problems for people to get well, why would you put your fingers right up there anyway when it's a small opening for a rat? But move on. So ultimately, I'm disappointed that there is no appetite to actually look at some sort of program where we can test new products. It means we're not an innovative council. It means that we're same old, same old. And as for a discussion about budgeting, $2,000 to $3,000 budgeting compared to some of the other things on the agenda tonight, I actually find that laughable. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Hamilton. I appreciate Councillor Hamilton's desire to have a look at alternative methods and to reduce the incidence of secondary poisoning in our town. If Councillor Hamilton had been willing to include an additional point where we had a better scoped trial, I would have been happy to consider that proposal, but at this point in time, based on the information provided by staff, the current budget expenditure that has been identified in the alternative isn't adequate for us to do a trial that would be worthwhile. I do think it is probably worth us looking into this in future and having a really good understanding of what using this product would involve, what the risks would be and what the costs would be to deliver this. In the absence of that information, I don't think that we can support the alternative, but I am happy to support the officer recommendation at this stage with being open to explore alternatives in the future. Is there anybody else who would like to speak against the motion? For the motion?
So if I could just speak against the motion, Mayor, just in terms of there not being a possibility to do a trial, could we please put in place some sort of review?
Councillor Hamilton, I think you're asking a question, are you?
It's Hilary McWilliam speaking.
Oh, sorry, I meant McWilliam, sorry. Was that a question that you're asking, whether a trial could be conducted?
Well, yeah, I am asking a question, but I guess the reason I'm speaking against the motion is because there is nothing in the motion at this point that says it will be looked at again. I know that you're suggesting that that would happen, but I'm not entirely sure it would.
No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying that I would have supported an additional point where the officers would give us more detailed information about a possible trial, including the risks and costs and so on. But in the absence of that point being added in, then I'm happy to support the officer recommendation. Okay, Councillor Barty, did you wish to close the debate?
No, I'm happy to waive my right to speak.
Okay, so we'll put that to the vote. At the moment, we have Councillor Barty for the motion, Councillor Wilson for the motion, Councillor Hamilton against the motion. Councillor Quinton, are you for or against?
I am for the motion.
Councillor Gangel?
Against, Your Worship.
Who have we missed? My apologies.
Councillor McWilliam?
Councillor McWilliam?
I'm against the motion, thank you.
You're against the motion? Okay, then I am for the motion, which means that it is carried.
Sorry, just a point of order, Mayor. It needs an absolute majority for point 1. How many votes is that? Can I just check?
4. So absolute majority is the majority when the entire council is present, so 4 out of 7. So if there were only 5 of us present, we would still require 4 to get an absolute majority.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Moving on to item 12.10, which is the draft land asset strategy. This item has had a proposed word changing by a couple of councillors for the officer recommendation. Councillor Gangel, you have a question?
Thank you, Your Worship.
So, just before you start, can I
Yep.
just remind councillors that the attachment relating to this item is confidential. So if you have questions that relate to anything that is confidential, then it would be necessary for us to go behind closed doors.
No, everything that I have is on public record, so I won't be saying anything that is not on public record.
Thank you.
So obviously on public record, we have a Lottery West grant for Surrey Street, so that's we're publicly acknowledged, we've promoted it and the like. What I'm wanting to know is there any proposal to hand back that Lottery West grant?
Maybe our CEO could respond to that question for us.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and Councillor Gangel. The Lottery West grant is tied to the redevelopment of Surrey Street. So obviously we will receive that monies upon proceeding with that development. So it is very much linked. Obviously, if that development doesn't occur, then the money will not be forwarded to the town.
And just a quick follow-up. To my memory, was that 350,000?
I might just ask our Director of Corporate Services to confirm that. Thank you.
Sorry, evening everyone. Thanks, Peter. Just checking. That's correct, $375,000. That's correct, Councillor Gangel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. White. Councillor Hamilton, you also have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to draw people's attention to the alternative that I put through. Well, it's actually a very slight amendment that I put through this afternoon, changing the first word of the officer's recommendation from adopts to receives, because I don't believe we should be adopting something that that needs to come back to council for each of these items.
Thank you, Councillor Hamilton. So is that you moving the officer recommendation with that amendment?
Did you say others had other amendments as well?
No, there were a number of councillors who had similar amendments to propose with different words, including receives, notes, instead of adopting. So I'm sure those councillors will be satisfied with the wording that you have proposed.
Okay, well, I'll move it, but certainly happy for other people to ask questions if they've still got questions.
Sure. I'm happy to second that as well, but if there are questions, please let us know.
Councillor Wilson here. Sorry, I'm just checking to see, is that the alternate wording being provided in the meeting chat, or is Councillor Hamilton able to read the proposed change to the officer recommendation?
So the only change being proposed by Councillor Hamilton is the officer recommendation currently reads that council adopts the draft land strategy, and it being changed to that council receives the draft land asset strategy.
Thank you, yes.
Okay, so if there's no further questions, it's been moved by Councillor Hamilton. I have seconded the motion. Is there anybody against? Okay, in that case, it is carried. Thank you, everyone. So now we're on to 12.11, which is the town centre revitalisation. So firstly, do the staff wish to speak to this item at all?
No. I think it's been discussed a few times with council. So unless there are any particular questions or areas councillors would like further clarification, happy to provide. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Councillor Gangel.
Thank you, Your Worship. So a new point on page 47 of the report. This project provides a strategic response to COVID-19 for our town centre and local economy through creating the right conditions for potential new housing, employment, supporting small business and greater social connection and development. This is not a short-term project, but one that has the potential to position the town favourably into the years to come. And I think the last wording there is years to come, because that actually doesn't create anything now. So my question is, what does the town have, considering the markets are questionable at this stage, what does the town have on the ground to support people getting back into our town centre?
Ms. Mabbs, is that a question for yourself?
I'm happy to respond to that. Obviously, over the last few months, there's been a number of changes that have been made to try and assist small business, both within the town centre and the broader district. We've certainly tried to reduce some red tape, but also to promote services like the Small Business Development Corporation and workshops and so on. Obviously, the situation over the last few months has evolved, and we've tried to remain dynamic and agile in our response in that regard. Obviously, the markets is something that we're considering, and shortly we'll be having a discussion with council, I guess, about the economic impact of some of the things we have been doing. We've not done an evaluation of a number of our events, so this will be a good opportunity to have an independent assessment of just what impact those measures have actually had, and a better understanding in terms of our planning going forward. So we've also asked small businesses to provide feedback to us on how we can help them. There hasn't been a lot of feedback in that regard, but we've certainly tried to be open. We're also obviously reviewing our local planning framework, and from a planning and development perspective, that is probably one of the most powerful mechanisms to try and facilitate economic development going forward. So there's a number of things going on, but in terms of an immediate impact, I guess one of the problems we've been challenged by over the last few months is the social distancing. But we are trying to encourage people to come back to the town centre. Obviously, we've opened the library, customer services is open as well. So that's generating some interest. Our community hall is full again. So community groups are all starting to come back. And obviously with the reduction in the restrictions over the coming months, that will only improve. So, but on the 7th of July, we will be discussing with Council our events program. So that'll be a good opportunity to discuss, I guess, the future path.
And just very quickly, I've just got 2 further questions, then I'm done. So I'm just wanting to know, is the oval in or out? And if the oval is in, does that mean the oval can be looked at for potential development on the outskirts of the oval? And secondly, what is the area of the town centre we are looking at? Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Gangel. Certainly, I think to proceed with a town centre plan and not consider Bassendean Oval would be a travesty. So I would like to propose that it is included. But one of the first milestones in proceeding with this proposal would be a inception and scoping workshop. And one of the first questions to be answered is drawing some parameters around what is the town centre for the purposes of this project. But also looking at the alignment with the proposed scheme as well. Sorry, Councillor Gangel, did I respond to all your questions?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Hamilton, your question.
Yes, just carrying on from that last statement from the CEO through the chair, I'm curious why we would approve this without having the scoping done properly in the first place, as we do with all other consultancies and contracts that we award. We always do the scoping first before we actually award. So I'm trying to actually understand the logic of why we're now reversing that process.
Thank you, Councillor Hamilton. I don't think it's a matter of reversing the process. We have set out in the proposal a broad scope of work in terms of the approach and also the deliverables for this project. As part of the, given this is a strategic project as well, I think similar to the Bassendian project, we had a broad scope of work, but really importantly, what worked was that we had an initial scoping workshop just to further clarify and ensure a shared understanding by council and senior officers at the beginning, but also having check-ins through the process as well, so that we remained responsive to the feedback that we were receiving. So rather than sort of continue along a straight train track and being oblivious to our environment and the feedback we're receiving, this is a responsive, agile project that needs to consider the feedback at each stage and ensure that, I guess, we're being responsive and the project delivers the outcomes that are required. So it is a bit different from you know, constructing a fence or mowing a lawn, or it's not a transactional project, it's a transformational project. So it requires, I guess, less control, less sort of detail up front, because it does require the need to, be open-minded, because we cannot predict the feedback and the response that we will get through this approach. Thank you.
I do have many further questions, but I'll carry on from that. I would disagree that, I won't bother going there because clearly we will have a difference of opinion. In respect to the various questions that I have made about allocating $100,000 to a specific supplier consultant, there have been obviously emails that have gone backwards and forwards over the last couple of weeks. And late this afternoon, I don't know if councillors have got to read the documents that were sent late this afternoon, only half an hour before the meeting, regarding the sole supplier reference in our planning policies. Now, basically, I'll read that out. It says the procurement of goods and services available from only one private sector source of supply, that is manufacturer, supplier or agency, is permitted. However, substantial evidence must be provided by the authorised officer to verify absolutely there is genuinely only one source of supply. This must be approved by director or CEO. Every endeavour to find alternative sources must be made. Written confirmation of this must be kept on file for later audit. Now, I also note that the heading on that section 6.2 in our own purchasing policy is sole source of supply, in brackets, monopoly supplier. So I struggle to understand. I would like somebody to explain to me how it is that community consultation and a town centre plan, there's only one supplier in Perth that can provide those services. I struggle to understand that. Can someone explain that to me?
Sorry, Councillor Hamilton. Could we please go behind closed doors? Could we stop the live streaming, please?
Councillor Wilson here. I move that we go behind closed doors.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. I'm happy to second that. Is there anybody against the motion? Okay, that is carried. Adam, can I ask you to please turn off the live streaming and Mr. White, the recording. Thank you. Councillors, just hold on a moment till we've had confirmation that those recordings have been ceased.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I've just stopped the recording on MS Teams. If you can give me one moment, I will go into the council chambers and stop the live stream.
Many thanks.